Well, hi everyone, and greetings from Northern Michigan. This is Bob the Science Guy. I'm finishing up my series on the Spanish influenza of 1918 to 1920. Now, in the fall of 1918, the first wave of the Spanish influenza had died down, and everybody breathed a sigh of relief. They thought that they were through. Now, the way the pandemic was handled in the fall of 1918 and the winter of 1918-1919 has many lessons for the waning days of the COVID pandemic today. So let's cue up the music and get going. The Sedition Act continued to make it very difficult for people to publish warnings of the Spanish influenza. A classic example of this is the Philadelphia Naval Yard, which had an outbreak of influenza in late summer 1918. So even though local physicians tried to warn public health officials about this emerging outbreak of Spanish influenza, they were met with denial. Large-scale public gatherings, such as a Liberty Bond drive in September, were not canceled. Other public gatherings, such as movie theaters, weddings, church services, etc., were not canceled. Alarmed, the physicians wrote letters to newspapers and contacted reporters. Nobody would discuss the story for fear of running afoul of the Sedition Act of 1918, which made it a 20-year felony to publish or talk about news that somehow could hurt the war effort. Philadelphia held its war bond drive, and within a matter of days, all 31 hospitals in the Philadelphia area were full of influenza cases. But this was not the case in all locations. In cities such as St. Louis and San Francisco, stringent social distancing policies were put into place. Church services were canceled. Large public gatherings and theaters were canceled. Public health officials enforced vigorously the wearing of gauze masks to prevent the spread of the disease. So even though San Francisco and St. Louis all had cases of Spanish influenza, the peak of those cases was lower than that in Philadelphia, and it was spread out over several months. This avoided overwhelming the healthcare facilities of those communities. By Thanksgiving, people were tired of the influenza. They were tired of being cooped up in their homes. The war was ending, and they wanted to go out and celebrate. They wanted a return to normalcy, and they lobbied public officials to relax the social distancing. For those of you following the news, you see that this is a similar situation as to what we find ourselves in with COVID-19 at this time. We've all been on lockdown for the last couple of months. Many of us have not been working. We're stuck in our homes. We need a break. We want to get out. We are starting to see protests in the street about this enforcement of social distancing. Like in 1918, we are tired of being stuck in our homes. We want to get out. We want to get on with our lives. We're lobbying our public officials to relax these restrictions. Now, with the cold eye of history, we can look back to the late fall of 1918, where people found themselves in these same situations, and public officials relaxed the stay-at-home orders. We had another outbreak of Spanish influenza in December. Now, the third wave of the Spanish influenza was a serious enough illness to have been of note all on its own. The only reason that we don't talk about it as much is it came right on the tails of the second wave, which was devastating. Yes, it was a little more mild than the second wave was, but it had very significant numbers of deaths. Interestingly enough, the cities like St. Louis and San Francisco that had enforced very strict social distancing during the second wave relaxed those social distancing requirements in time for the third wave, and as a result, they blunted the effect of the second wave, but the third wave hit those cities the hardest. As devastating as the second wave was for loss of life, the consequences of the third wave of the Spanish influenza may have reached and affected history. In the spring of 1919, the warring powers gathered in Paris, France, to work out the Treaty of Versailles, which not only would end the conflict of World War I, but would shape the fate of Europe for the decades to come. When it came to the fate of Germany, there were two schools of thought. The victorious European allies who had borne the brunt of the heavy lifting during World War I, paid the highest price, favored a punitive settlement to be imposed upon the Germans. On the other side was the American president Woodrow Wilson. While the First World War was devastating to Europe, we had gone through a similar experience some 60 years before during our Civil War. As that conflict ended in 1865, there again were two schools of thought. There was a school of thought to punish the South for rebelling against the Union, to the point of not only hanging every officer in the Confederate Army, hanging the NCOs just for good measure. On the other side, there was President Abraham Lincoln, who realized that the South was part of the future of the United States, and he favored a settlement where they were welcomed back into the Union and made a part of the country going forward. Woodrow Wilson seems to have had a similar attitude towards the Central Powers following World War I. He felt that in order for Europe and the world to move forward, the settlement had to be equitable to Germany, and they needed to be welcomed back into the world community because they were going to be a part of the future of Europe. Prime Minister Clemenceau approached President Wilson with very punitive terms for the proposed Treaty of Versailles. Wilson opposed them vigorously, to the point that he threatened to leave the conference and return to the United States. However, at the time, Paris was suffering an outbreak from this third wave of the Spanish influenza. 2,600 people eventually died, including one of Wilson's aides. Wilson became ill with a temperature of 102 to 103. He had delirium. His physicians were so alarmed by the symptoms that they were concerned that it may represent an assassination attempt by poisoning. Wilson was deathly ill and did not recover for nearly a week. When he was able to return to the conference, he was a changed man. He was easily distracted. He had confusion. His personality changed. And when Clemenceau approached him with the same terms again, he acquiesced. In its final form, the Treaty of Versailles was extremely harsh to Germany. It took territory. It destroyed its economy. It was a direct affront to the national pride and identity of Germany. It set up the conditions for right-wing extremist groups, such as the Nazis, to come to power. Did the Spanish flu cause World War II? No more than it ended World War I. But it certainly did not help in either case. Now, in closing, one of the final victims of the third wave of the Spanish influenza was the founder of my profession. Sir William Osler was a Canadian physician, and with 3 others, founded the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. He was a minimalist when it came to treating patients. He felt that doctors sometimes did more harm to patients than their diseases did. And one of the overwhelming lessons that he infused in his students and those of us that are the descendants of his students is to re-inject humanity into medicine. His condition steadily worsened over the weeks, and he died of the disease on December 29, 1919. Shortly before his death, he was asked by a reporter what he thought of the Spanish influenza. What he proceeded to say was probably the most Canadian thing that I've ever heard in my life. He said he had a very interesting case that he had been following for 2 months. His only regret was that he wouldn't be able to witness the postmortem. That pretty much defines grace under pressure and professionalism. Now, another thing that I want to address is the politics of pandemics. We've seen a vast gap between the people that are more towards the liberal spectrum versus the more conservative right-wing spectrum. One particular political group seems to have made a cottage industry out of denying COVID exists, denying that masks are effective, trying to turn this into an issue of freedom rather than public health. And one of the major problems that we had with COVID was our leadership, when this emerged, did not buy into a pandemic. They didn't take adequate preventative measures. They didn't take it seriously until it became very apparent that this was a serious illness, including the President of the United States coming down with the disease and receiving absolute top-notch medical care, and then not pressing for vaccinations. Now, this is a particular website that I came across the other day. It's called the United Spot, and it is a parody comedy website. At least that's what it calls itself. But if you happen to look through who they're doing parodies of, there seems to be a proclivity to single out a particular political party. And that's fine. I don't mind people making fun of politicians. I make fun of them myself. However, they are taking on this vaccine issue and they're presenting it in a very bad light. Many of you may have seen this Joker series that they're putting out. I'm going to actually have a look at a couple of these in upcoming videos, because these are sending a very dangerous message to the people of the United States and the world for that matter. Anybody that can see these videos can get a very bad impression of what COVID is and what the preventative measures for COVID entail. I'll be hitting this later on in the week. So until then, this is Bob the Science Guy signing out from Northern Michigan. Thank you very much for stopping by, and I'll see you again soon. Stay healthy, folks.
Mama, please make them hear me, or I can't teach them anymore. This rabbit hole's too deep for me. Feel my brain getting real sore. Bob the Science Guy. Bob the Science Guy.